Hey everybody, how are you today? I'm super pumped because this is the second to last lecture for first semester, so woohoo, I'm pumped just like you guys. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, Section 3, and I'm going to throw in a little bit of spice from Chapter 8 as well because I talk about that in the President video. So remember, if you haven't been keeping up on your President video assignments, it's time to start catching up. It's not due till next Wednesday, so really the big focus is to get your newspaper project done, and email me if you need help with that or have questions. But yeah, the President video is due next Wednesday, and then you'll have to get your test done by next Friday. So I know there's a crunch, there always is, it's the end of the semester. So in Section 3, they focus on three presidents here. They focus on President Theodore Roosevelt, then they focus on President Taft, and then they focus on President Wilson. Roosevelt is by far the most important president. So we're going to talk today about what were his accomplishments, how he came into office, what was his domestic policy, meaning what were his plans for the United States, because he was truly a progressive president. He actually goes on to create the Progressive or Bull Moose political party after his time in office and tries to run for the presidency again unsuccessfully in 1912. And we're also going to take a look at his foreign policy because he was instrumental in imperialism as well and trying to expand the U.S. presence around the globe and to, increase our ability to trade and to connect with other countries and to show the world that we were a force to be reckoned with. So if you have not watched the last president clip yet on McKinley, you need to do so. But President McKinley was assassinated September 6, 1901 by Leon Czolgosz. And that's Leon Czolgosz right there. I think I'm slightly mispronouncing his name. It's all right. But you should definitely know that's Leon, Leon Czolsz. I think that's going to be one of the questions on the review sheet, which I'll probably post tomorrow. And you'll have that due, next Wednesday. I have it posted. It's due right now, but I could always move that back to next Thursday or Friday as well. So you'll have the review questions due and then the test. But Leon Czolgosz is very angry with the president. He is a disgruntled immigrant. He is angry about unemployment. He feels like he deserves a better life. He basically goes in to see the president. It looks like he's injured. It looks like he has a bandaged hand and he had wrapped it up. And that's what you can kind of see there on his right hand. But in reality, he was not injured. It was not just a bandaged hand, kind of wrapped up or anything. It was actually a gun. And he shoots the president. Now, you would think that they would have learned, after Garfield had been assassinated just a few short years earlier, that the president needed more protection, he needed more bodyguards. They still really hadn't. This president was still highly accessible, and people could wait in line, and they could meet the president and, talk to him about their issues, and that's exactly what happened here. And he was definitely an anarchist. He was against the president for various reasons because the president truly, supported robber barons and capitalism. He wasn't interested in helping the common man or giving them better wages. So he didn't support any of the socialist views, basically, that Czolgosz shared. He also was pro-imperialism and, was interested in taking over other countries at the benefit of the United States for political, economic power, kind of justifying it with social Darwinism and white man's burden. And so the president is killed. So what that means is that this man here, Theodore, or he was often called Teddy Roosevelt, he is an accidental president. He was vice president of the United States, and now he is president. Now, during McKinley's first term in office, when the Spanish-American War was going on, remember, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So he was assisting at improving the United States Navy, at realizing that we were at a great disadvantage compared to, England. He had started to rebuild it. It was important that he did. That was one of the reasons we were so successful during the Spanish-American War. He was very egotistical. He believed the United States was far superior than other countries. And that's kind of why he was pro-imperialism, because he wanted to expand our way of life, thinking that it was beneficial to others to kind of learn our ways and learn from us. And of course, he led the Rough Riders, during the Spanish-American War, that group of cowboys and cavalrymen as they charged San Juan Hill. He was incredibly brave, perhaps a little bit naive about the possibility of death. But ultimately, right, that war had, low casualties, was won rather quickly, was rather inexpensive, except for the peace treaty, right, and Treaty of Paris 1898, which cost the U.S. $20 million for the Philippines, and he became a hero. So as McKinley ran for a second term, in 1900, he asked Teddy Roosevelt to be his vice president. to try to make sure that he, won a second term, and he won it easily. And then in 1901, he was assassinated. So Teddy actually considers McKinley's second term to be his true first term as president. And he does a lot of stuff. So let's talk here about his domestic policies, things that he does within the United States. So one of the things that he does is, the interesting thing about Teddy Roosevelt is that he claims he is a Republican, that he is a member of the Republican Party. Republican Party, for the most part, is definitely pro-business, and it usually supports business owners. It does not usually support employees as much, meaning that the focus is not usually on gaining higher wages or things of that matter. It's more focused on the business owners. So it's interesting because he's supposedly a Republican, yet in all reality, he's really interested in the rights of laborers. And as you watch the president video today, tomorrow, whenever, you'll hear some of the people from History Channel, some of these famous historians talk about how Teddy Roosevelt is actually a Democrat. And maybe he just didn't label himself as a Democrat because it was a dirty word back then, basically. There were very few Democrats that were able to come to office. Grover Cleveland was the only one during this period. Many people still viewed Democrats as the racist group from the Civil War. But he definitely seems more of a Democrat man. And that's because when it came to the anthracite coal miner strike, these men were on strike because of the same basic reasons anybody is on strike. They wanted better pay, they wanted shorter hours, and the conditions in the mines were grueling. A lot of them suffered health issues. They were highly unsafe. And so they're on strike. And the strike was incredibly difficult because since so many of these coal miners were on strike in Pennsylvania, a lot of coal was not coming out of the mines because obviously they're like, nope, we're on strike. And it turned into what we really refer to as a general strike, where a lot of other people who worked in coal mines across the East Coast decided that they were not going to work either. They were going to all go on strike in support of their brethren because they wanted, better pay, shorter hours, safer conditions. So they all kind of go on strike together. And that meant that people potentially were going to not have enough coal that winter because they were going to freeze. It's how they were heating their homes still. So he works it out. He brings in what we call an arbitrator. And an arbitrator is someone who tries to make a compromise and says, we need to work this out. We need to come up with a solution that's what management accepts. Sorry, management, you're not going to make as much money as you usually do, but we're also going to help the employees and get them better pay. That's why we say he's somewhat of a Democrat, because he was not interested in assisting robber barons or big businesses or anything like that in terms of corporations. He was definitely focused on the average American worker. And he really is all about giving people what he called a square or a fair or an equal deal, where he was balancing the interests of consumers and laborers alike. Now, he also is an interesting man, and a lot of people would consider him to be a Democrat, and he gains a lot of enemies with the robber barons who loved McKinley, right? Because they donated to McKinley's election campaign, and that's perhaps how McKinley got elected, because he had all these money from people like Rockefeller and such. But when it comes to Roosevelt, he's not like that at all. He, in fact, does not like J.P. Morgan's company, specifically his Northern Securities Company. And he says something's going on here. Remember that in 1900, Andrew Carnegie had sold U.S. Steel, which was the largest corporation in America and was clearly a monopoly, which had, remember, gone through vertical integration. He sells that to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan at this time has also been buying up railroads from the likes of Vanderbilt, who's no longer around, Jay Gould, and now he's buying up banks. So he has clearly multiple monopolies. Now remember, the Sherman antitrust law exists, which says that monopolies are illegal. Monopolies are bad. Monopolies restrain trade. They hurt the average consumer. They mean that people have to pay higher prices. He goes after them. He obviously does not sue them personally, but he gets the U.S. Justice Department, the head lawyer for the country, the Attorney General, to look into it and to bring a lawsuit against it. It is a huge lawsuit, and ultimately they find in favor of Teddy Roosevelt and the U.S. government, saying, J.P. Morgan, you have to break up your trust. So until this point, we had the Sherman Antitrust Act in existence, It had been around at this point for about 14 years, but it really had not been truly used to kind of break up existing monopolies. It was just kind of stopping new monopolies from being formed. And now we're starting to take away the power of the robber barons. And over time, especially once Taft and Wilson come into office, they're going to pass more laws to try to break up trusts. Now, the interesting thing is he doesn't break up all trusts. He is kind of saying, well, some trusts are good and some trusts are bad. And he lets the Commerce Department kind of decide, which is kind of shady, but still, it's a move in the right direction. He's also trying to help the farmers. And remember, farmers were very unhappy because big companies like Rockefeller or like Carnegie or JP Morgan, they were able to get decreased prices because they would say to a train company, we need to basically rent all of your train cars to ship our goods from one side of the country to the other. You know, the oil from Texas back to the East Coast, wherever it may be going. And so since they were buying up the whole train, they were getting a discount. The average small farmer would never be offered such a discount. And they said this was unfair. And so starting now, we're starting to see with powers of the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, are increasing. And Congress passes a law called the Hepburn Act, which says, you know, really and truly, we need to make sure that railroad shipping rates are regulated and everybody is paying the same price. Now, he did a lot of other things to really help the average American. So as you're coming up with your rating, remember for each president, as you go through, in the president's assignment, you're giving them 5 or 10 facts per president. I think the only one that required 10 was Lincoln. I think all the rest are 5 facts. And then you're giving them a rating, and you're explaining the rating. You don't have to give 5 reasons, okay, why you came up with that rating. Just how did you come up with it? What's your thought process? And a lot of people do give Teddy Roosevelt a 5. And I personally think he was an awesome president. Kind of a psycho, but most of them are, you know, kind of crazy. But one of the reasons I really like him is because he passes the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. What had happened was that a man by the name of Upton Sinclair, he had written a book, you can see it over off to the side here, called The Jungle. And in this book, The Jungle, it was supposedly talking about a man who worked in the Chicago meatpacking plants. As, you know, the cattle were being brought in from Texas, right? And they were going through the long drive, and then they were shipped back to Chicago and they were processed, and then you'd get your hamburgers. Well, the book talked about how as you ate that food, a lot of the processes were unclean. And we know for a fact that rats were just crawling into these huge vats of meat at night. And of course, as the meat was heated and cooked and cooled overnight, the rats would get trapped in there and they would die, and they were never picked out. So literally, and then they would go through a meat grinder. So you were eating meat that potentially had rat tails, rat hairs, rat parts. I know, it's nasty. Also, people had accidents. And so we know that there was stories of perhaps even fingernails or blood or even human skin stuck in with your meat. And the story was absolutely disgusting. And it was truth, okay? It was talking about, it had true facts in it, but it was supposedly a fictionalized story, about what happened. But the point of the story is at the end of it, it was supposed to get you to support socialism because it talked about what a terrible existence this man had working in the factory and how he was paid low, and it was trying to get you to support socialism. Remember, the economic system where everybody's paid the same and treated equally. But that's not what happened at all. This book became wildly popular in the United States. Teddy Roosevelt read this, and he was like, that's disgusting. He wasn't going to become socialist, not by any means. Just because you are, democratic in your views does not mean by any means you support socialism. What he did think, though, was our food is nasty. He created the Pure Food and Drug Act, which he said from here on out, and the Meat Inspection Act, I want to know what is in our food. Especially because, remember, this is a time period where we've got Coca-Cola on the market. And people were very interested in what is that secret product, that secret ingredient of Coca-Cola? Is it cocaine? People were buying hair tonics that would supposedly you'd put it on your hair and make your hair grow. But in reality, maybe it was causing cancer or having your hair fall out. People were taking vitamins that would supposedly make you grow if you weren't tall enough, or, weight loss pills. None of this was regulated. So by creating the Food and Drug Administration, which we still have to this day, it was a huge step in helping the average American person, which is part of the reason why I think he's a cool president. Now, he also really cared about our environment. He's an interesting guy about our environment. When I say he cared about our environment, he's not like what you would think of as a modern day tree hugger. He's not the guy who's going to recycle or care about the last species of an animal that's endangered. He's not like that at all. He is someone who is a hunter. He is an outdoorsman. He loves to hunt. He would have liked to have gone on safari. He liked to travel to other places. He loved to fish. He loved to camp. His buddy, Gifford Pinchot, you see him in the top picture, he is actually a man who coined the word conservation, and he said conserve. So they're like the original Green Party tree huggers in a sense. They're very different than what we would think of today as being environmentalists, but they moved things in the right direction because what he said was, he said, look, the way that robber barons are going, they're buying up so much land and turning it into factories. Before you know, there's going to be no America left. So he helps create the Forest Reserve Act and the Forest Service, where he says we need to protect our land. We need to have national parks. We need to have places where Americans can go and hike. We need to protect its natural beauty so it's not just all turned into a shopping mall, because we are starting to see the beginning of department stores and things like that. And so he basically takes about 100 million acres of land and he adds them to the national forest. So the reason that we have the Grand Canyon and some of those parks like Yosemite, all of that is because of Teddy Roosevelt. So if you like to camp or hunt or fish, he was definitely an outdoorsman like that. And he wanted to protect that beauty so that you could enjoy America. There was a bit of debate continuously between his friend John Muir, which you see in the bottom picture at Yosemite, and his buddy Gifford Pinchot. They had different views on environmentalism, which, like I said, would exist today between modern environmentalists and Teddy Roosevelt, who was kind of the first one as far as pushing for things. But, you know, Teddy Roosevelt is kind of our original Lorax here, speaking for the trees. And you can kind of see in this image in red all the different national parks and when they're established. A lot of them are established after his time in office, but he really kind of gets the ball rolling on when these national parks and national forests are created. Now let's move into talking about foreign policy. So he is this progressive-minded president who is supposedly a Republican but acts a lot more like a Democrat. And he is also, remember, pro-imperialism. He talked very much so about how he desperately thought that America needed a war. He was obsessed with going to war with Spain. He thought we were the better country, convinced himself we were going to go in and liberate the Cubans and actually help them from General Weyler and the Butcher. Yet, in the meantime, he had no qualms whatsoever with taking over Puerto Rico or Guam or controlling the Philippines, because he thought that we were the superior nation and that they would benefit, right, from our help, right? And so he definitely bought into white man's burden and that kind of stuff. Now, I mentioned before that before he became president, he was vice president, and before that he was serving the Spanish-American War, right, as head of the Rough Riders, and he was also Secretary of the Navy. So let's back up and let's talk about his involvement with the Navy a little bit. And as far as the Navy, it's going to be very important that we build up our Navy. He kind of started building it up, before we actually went to war with Spain, and that buildup is going to continue after he becomes president. And the reason you need a huge Navy is if you start to take over land all over the world, you need to send soldiers, right? An army, right, over there. So you need ships, you need navies. And if you're planning on also kind of taking over territory across the globe and then getting free resources from these people that you have just conquered, you need ships to be able to get there. So the Navy is going to be very important. Now, even before Teddy Roosevelt became president or vice president or even Secretary of the Navy, earlier presidents, really going back to even the 1850s, they had started to realize that we needed to get more of a modern Navy like the British. And that would be essential because we would want to start getting into more contact with the rest of the world, even though we were technically isolationists at that point. So way back in the 1850s, even before the United States fought the Civil War, we had started building up our Navy, and we had sent an American naval officer by the name of Matthew Perry to Japan. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit about Japan here because they've been totally off our radar. We haven't mentioned them at all this year. But as we're moving into second semester, Japan's going to be, of course, a big player when we get to World War II. Japan, okay, has been an isolated country for years. All the way up until the 1800s, China was the big player. China was the one that, was considered the powerhouse in Asia, had the largest economy, the largest population, was trying to take over other territory. By the time we move into the 1800s, though, China is on the decline, right? And people in China are fighting with each other over power. The dynasty is losing power. Britain gets involved and people are, taking drugs in the Opium War. And then Japan really is starting to focus on perhaps increasing their wealth and their power. And what's going to happen is that when in 1853, when Matthew Perry shows up until that point, Japan had been very isolated. And perhaps it was because they were fearful, they were mistrustful of the West. They practiced, a very traditional way of life, right, with the samurai who would, basically pledge their allegiance and loyalty to serving others. They followed a code of honor called the Bushido, and there were these noble landowners who owned a lot of land called the daimyo. It was basically a farming community. So we had farmers, we had fishermen, we had soldiers who were your samurai. We had an old kind of kingly, monarchy type system. But they were very isolated because China was the big powerhouse and they kind of wanted to not tick off China. And so they kind of just kept to themselves, hoping that they would not be conquered. And they also did not want to get involved with other foreign countries. They felt like their culture was superior and they had nothing to gain from foreign powers. So in 1853, when Perry shows up, he really gets the Chinese to begin trading, to get communicating with the rest of the world. And unfortunately, it's kind of the big change. Once Japan starts communicating with the US, trading with the US, getting new technology, they quickly revolutionize and they go through the first and second industrial revolution very quickly. And then they get caught up in their own age of imperialism and they realize if the United States is taking over territory and the British and the French and the Germans, they want to be into it. And so they take over Korea, and they end up controlling Korea from 1910 all the way to 1945, enslaving the people, taking their resources. And as China grows weaker, they start to take over portions of China. And then, of course, it is their goal to gain a sphere of influence, which remember means like exclusive trade rights. They're trying to take over as much of Asia as they possibly can. And then, of course, as we get to World War II, they're interested in perhaps splitting up the world with Mussolini, head of Italy, and Hitler, head of Germany. So is imperialism a good, a bad thing? Obviously, it's in the eyes of the beholder as far as perspective. But when we open up trade with Japan, which all really had even started before Teddy Roosevelt's time, it had unintended consequences, and it leads to Japan's rise in power, which later leads to problems with Japan and eventually them attacking us on December 7th, right? Which we just had the anniversary of that this week. Now, the other thing to talk about when it comes to Asia is our relationship with China. And I've mentioned that China obviously has had problems for years, right? I talked about how in the late 1800s, we started to see that people were trying to overthrow the dynasty, which is basically a monarchy system. Basically, it's called the dynastic cycle, and it was this idea that one family was in power because the gods approved it. And then if they started to see floods or famine, which resulted from floods, and rebellion, clearly they had lost the favor of the gods and a new family was supposed to come into power. It was a way to justify the change of power from one group to the next. But people were starting to want to have more of a say in the government. There was internal fighting. There was more famine than before. And then, of course, as the British started to come in with drugs, you had this Opium War. They can't fight back. And before you know it, the British are starting to colonize and to carve out pieces of land from China. And now Russia's getting interested in trying to take over China because they just have to move to the south. You've got the French who are interested, Germans, and China really seems just unable to fight back. And of course, they were a country with vast amounts of coal and natural resources, which were the powerhouses of the Industrial Revolution. Yet they had not industrialized themselves. They were a farming community which was vastly illiterate. And so, we start to see these other countries really starting to snap up parts of China. So the United States steps in. And the United States steps in, and Teddy Roosevelt's going to be big on this. When he actually is in office, he's going to be sending in a man by the name of John Hay. And John Hay is going to be talking with the Chinese and with these other countries and basically lays down the law and says, look, you know, we need to make sure that, nobody basically gets involved and just thinks that they can take over China. Teddy Roosevelt was smart because he's like, if Britain would somehow take over all of China, they would have all of China, all of India, plus they have Australia, New Zealand, portions of Canada. Their empire would just be too big. Not to mention the fact that they've got South Africa, Egypt, and, nearly a third of the African continent. So now that we've started to assert our dominance with the Spanish-American War, the thought process was we have to go in and assert our dominance in China. We weren't so naive as to think we could take over China. We had a hard enough time in the Philippines, which were small islands. Taking over China would have been extremely difficult. The people would have resisted us, just like they were resisting the British. And he just wants to make sure that he basically has the mentality of, if we can't have China, nobody else can. So this open door policy says there has to be an open door, meaning an open relationship where anyone can come into China and trade with them. But he doesn't want to see the British or anybody else trying to conquer the Chinese people, because it would increase their power, it would increase their wealth. So there is basically this open access and communication. So Teddy Roosevelt was really a mastermind in trying to make sure that. I also forgot to mention that Teddy Roosevelt, on the last slide, I was going to mention that he actually gets a Nobel Peace Prize because Japan really starts to increase its power over time. I mentioned how they tried to take over Korea, and they did, but Japan also tries to take over territory owned by Russia. And he negotiates a peace settlement so that a major crisis is averted between Japan and Russia, and the world congratulates him, and he gets a Nobel Peace Prize for that. And it's not like they give those out just freely to everyone. That's pretty impressive. So Teddy Roosevelt helps stop a war, basically he helps stop World War I in China, and he helps stop a war between Japan and Russia. So he does it's interesting. He has imperialist ambitions for us, but he also kind of checks the imperialist ambitions for other countries when he knows it is necessary. And he was probably right about trying to make sure that nobody controlled China, because there was something called the Boxer Rebellion, where the Chinese people really did start to attack and murder, all of the foreigners that were trying to take over China. The U.S. kind of had to help stop that, Boxer Rebellion, which was part of the reason why Teddy Roosevelt knew that we needed this open door policy where no one should be taking over China, and everyone should have no one should have exclusive trade rights. No one should have a sphere of influence in China. Everybody should have equal access to trade there. Also during his presidency, he continues to build up all of our battleships. He calls them his Great White Fleet. And he's got 16 battleships at this point. He gets new modern guns and weapons. And he puts them on a world tour to kind of show the world how strong we are, not to mess with us. So don't think that you can take away our newly acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from us. And he kind of just shows our militaristic imperialist stance. But this is also going to be what helps lead us to World War I, because as we build up our Navy, the Germans build up their Navy, and the British build up their Navy, because they're worried about our actions. Since we do seem to be on the rise to get more land, what if we start to take away some of their land, just like we took away Spain's? Almost done here, hang in there. The other big claim to fame that Teddy Roosevelt is going to do is he, of course, builds the Panama Canal. And he'd been thinking about building a Panama Canal for years. So many other presidents had as well. If, for example, an American businessman wanted to, take goods that were being produced in Florida and they wanted to send them to California, they would either, of course, go across the United States, which would take forever. There's no highways at this point. There's still very few vehicles. There's no Amazon Prime, 2-day delivery. So if they were going to go by ship, though, it would be ridiculously long, like a 3 to 4 month journey to go from Florida to go all the way around South America and then have it go to California. So it probably would, be quicker to go across the United States, but we didn't have those interstate highways yet. And so what his thought process was, Panama is such a narrow country. Is there any way to basically cut through the land, so that boats could come through here, and it would cut off so, much time on that journey? Would it make it possible? That was one of his thought process. And we are going to eventually make that canal. Now, the other big claim to fame, and I guess I should speed ahead to that canal stuff, which is right here. I kind of mentioned that before, but yes, ultimately it's this whole idea that, we wanted to build a canal. It would speed up our shipping costs. It would decrease time to get a product somewhere. But it's going to be very difficult to build a canal because Panama was not technically a free country. Panama was part of the country called Colombia, and you can see that here in the map. And we asked the Colombians if we basically could dig through Panama to build this canal, and that it would be in our benefit and they could use it. And the Colombians said no. They rejected our deal where we had proposed to give them $10 million so that we could build it, and then we would give them $250,000 to build it, and they could hire their local workers. So we're like, this is going to be good. Give us $10 million. We'll pay you $10 million so we can build it. We'll pay you basically $250,000 a year to use it. Plus, we'll give you money to pay for the cost to build it. You can hire local workers. And we're like, this will be fantastic. But they rejected all of that. And so we started talking to some of the local people in Panama, and it turned out, of course, they didn't want to be controlled by Colombia. They wanted their freedom. So we go ahead, and the U.S. government, the U.S. Navy and Army, kind of in more of a covert mission. This is kind of the beginning still. We don't truly have an FBI, or CIA yet, a Central Intelligence Agency. But we do give them money, weapons, guns, support to the Panamanian people. They just magically, show up. And the idea is, well, if Colombia won't let us dig through Panama to build this canal, and they won't make a deal with us, and they basically have, rejected our treaty here. Oops, sorry there, guys. A little issue technically. So basically the idea is that when it comes to building this canal, if the Colombians won't agree to the deal that we've proposed, we basically bring in these illegal guns and we say to the Panamanians, we're going to help you revolt and get your independence. And they're able, because there's more Panamanian people than there are Colombian troops stationed there, plus now they have superior weapons, kind of backed illegally by the United States. They launched this revolt, and it's highly successful. And 3 days after the revolt, we declare Panama independent, and we recognize them, as their own sovereign nation. And of course, the fighting continues on for a ways after, but Colombia starts to realize that they're going to have to take on perhaps the United States, because now that we have acknowledged them as a free country, they see the writing on the wall. They see this is the same situation as what happened in the Spanish-American War. And they're like, do we really want to fight a war with the United States? Or do we really just want to work out some kind of deal? And so they work out a deal. It's not as good as the one that was originally proposed, where we were offering them $10 million plus $250,000 a year. But ultimately, they're forced to give up Panama. And so now Panama is an independent country. We're going to not make them a protectorate like Cuba. We're not interested in gaining another country, perhaps because of the cost, perhaps because, Teddy Roosevelt thinks it'll look bad for our image, that we're expanding too greatly, that we're, too much of a world power. But he basically lets, Panama go off on its own, but tries to encourage them to be a democracy and tries to offer them help and support. And he goes ahead and he helps build, or I should say create, this treaty called the I Buenaventura Treaty, which is the deal which we strike with them to build the canal. And so we start building the canal. Okay, it's going to take about 10 years to build the canal. Teddy Roosevelt was a very hands-on president. He is the first president to fly in an airplane, to dive in a submarine. He has no problem with traveling to Panama and flying in a plane to get there, or taking a ship. He doesn't care. It's really interesting compared to other presidents who were, afraid to, flip a light switch in the White House. He is willing to try all sorts of new things. He's very hands-on. They hire lots of local laborers. It's good for the Panamanian economy. It's going to cost about $400 million. And of course, people are going to die on the job because of landslides, because of weather. Americans who are on site or who are engineers and architects are going to die from malaria and from the local diseases. 5,600 people die overall. And you can see the different locks. A lock is basically where you're going to have to try to change the water level from the Pacific Ocean to, from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean as you are locking through. You're changing the water levels so that your boat can go through those different areas. And so it does take, some time to lock through, but it's going to be very quick, basically, for the United States to go from Florida through the Caribbean, now over to California or wherever our ships are intended. So this is going to make it possible for us to get to the Philippines much quicker, to basically protect our interests, but also to get more resources. So in the long run, it definitely is to our advantage. Now, we ended up controlling this canal for about 100 years. In the Iponzafate Treaty, we had signed this treaty between the Panamanians, the Americans, and the British, where we all got to use the canal for the next 100 years. And in 2000, the canal's control finally returned back to the Panamanians. We still use it, but now obviously we're going to have to pay to use it. It's not simply ours, so to speak. The other thing that I wanted to go back and talk about quickly here was something called the Monroe Doctrine. Oops, sorry, I'm having technical issues today. Last thing I wanted to talk about was the Monroe Doctrine. And once upon a time, way back in 1823, James Monroe had been president of the United States, and he basically had said, look, if any country tries to take over any land in Central or South America, I'm going to see that as a personal attack on me and the United States of America. Basically, the Western Hemisphere is off limits. If you try to conquer them, if you try to control them, switch their government, I'm going to see this as a threat on the United States. I will defend that nation, and then I will attack you as well. Now, this policy has basically been in place all these years, and no country has challenged it. Teddy Roosevelt was a little bit concerned, though, because in this age of imperialism, Britain, France, Germany, right, are trying to take over land all over the world. And he was really concerned because Venezuela could not pay back some of its loans to these various European nations. The Dominican Republic was also having trouble repaying its debts. And so he was afraid that these European powers would be like, well, you took out loans and you bought military weapons with this money, and now you can't give back the guns, you can't repay these loans, we're going to get hostile and take over. He was afraid that this was going to happen. So he expands upon the Monroe Doctrine, and he adds an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. And a corollary is basically an addition. And so it becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or the Roosevelt addition to the Monroe Doctrine, where he basically says that we have a right and we have a duty, kind of like white man's burden, but we have a duty to help countries who are less fortunate than us, and that we have to help those nations in Latin America, in Central and South America, and we have a right to intervene in their affairs. We need to help them. And so it's not just, even though that policy had never been tested, the Monroe Doctrine, from here on out, we are going to assist nations and stop any European country from attacking them. And we're going to make sure that no one colonizes or has any imperialist interests in the Western Hemisphere. He, if you notice in this political cartoon, has a big, huge bat or stick, because this was often referred to as big stick diplomacy. In fact, he has a famous quote where he says, "Speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far." Meaning that if you come into a room, you don't have to say a word. If you have an intimidating look on your face and a huge bat, people know not to mess with you. And it basically was saying, don't mess with any countries in Central or South America, or you mess with the United States. And this becomes our excuse to basically help countries in Central and South America for the next 30 years. All right, sorry guys, I did that a little bit out of order. That wraps that all up now. I'll post these on Google Classroom, so that will help you as well. Have a great day.